Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Natural resource lecture on energy of life. So we just got done talking about chemistry of life and biomolecules, and now we're going to kind of talk about the connection between energy and chemistry and life or ecology. Okay? So we're going to talk about how energy flows, how we measure energy, where's the energy coming from, these kind of things. And this is just a really brief overview of more talks to come. Okay, we'll dive a lot deeper into this. I'm just skimming the top of talking about energy flow or energy of life. Okay, so to start with, you can see here this is typically called a food web. And we can pick out players, we can pick out the primary producers here, okay, the organisms that have the ability to do photosynthesis, okay, and so capture photons, convert it into carbohydrates, okay, the things that eat them, okay, the things that eat them, on and on and on up, okay, and we'll talk about the 10% rule, that each conversion, only 10% of the energy is left for the next group. Okay, and we'll talk about why that is and what that means for higher order predators or higher order systems. Okay, but we'll get there. All right, so first let's just talk about energy real quickly. Okay? Energy is the ability to do work. Okay? We talked about this before when we were talking about chemicals and molecules, and we're talking about bond energy. Well, that bond energy, why it gets called energy, is because when the bond is broken, energy is released, okay? And that energy can be utilized somewhere else to do work, to drive work. Okay? And so that brings us to really some distinguishing types of energy. You can have kinetic energy, which is movement energy. Okay, and most of you probably heard of this in a general physics class or an environmental science class that you might have had in high school, or a biology class that you had, or something along those lines. But kinetic energy is moving energy. Okay? So momentum is an example of kinetic energy. Potential energy is stored energy, and that stored energy could be chemically stored. Okay? So potential can be the same as chemical energy, right? And so it depends on what stored energy we're talking about. Is it stored in food? Is it stored in something that we can burn? Okay, then that's chemical energy and potential energy. Potential energy could also be something as simple as a rock on a cliff, and you give it a little push, okay? That has potential energy also, but you're not breaking bonds, you're not burning it, you're not doing anything to cleave the chemical energy. So all chemical energy is potential, but not all potential energy is chemical energy. Okay? Hope that makes sense. Now, one way that we can take and measure how much energy is being released or how much potential energy something has is we can transfer it into heat. Okay? And this is classic examples, classic experiments a long time ago would take things like, and to a degree they're still done this way, would take something like a hamburger. So let's say we take a hamburger and we put it in a bomb kilometer, which is really just a metal case that is enclosed, and then there's water around it. Okay? And you could burn that hamburger inside that, and it would transfer heat into the water, and we'd look at the difference in temperature. Okay? The difference in temperature could then be converted into calories, and it would tell you how many calories that hamburger had. Okay? So we often do this when it comes to heat. We represent energy in the form of heat. Okay? And that brings us kind of to thermodynamics. Okay? When we're talking about energy from a thermodynamic point of view, okay, and we're talking about photosynthesis, okay, we can talk about energy from the sun. Okay? So the energy that is coming from the sun, okay, is the energy that really runs the planet, okay, and can be captured by organisms and utilized to make carbohydrates. It can be captured by organisms to warm their body. It can be captured by the oceans. It can be captured by the soil. It can be captured by many different objects, okay? And then that energy can be transferred to different organisms, okay? And that brings us to kind of the first law of thermodynamics. Now, this is very similar to the law of matter, okay? And that energy, just like matter, is neither created nor destroyed, okay? It is converted, okay? It might change shape, okay? But overall, it's not created nor destroyed. It just moves, okay? So energy that comes in to a organism's body also leaves its body in some kind of form. The second law of thermodynamics is kind of one that keeps the planet going. I mean, both do, but the second law of thermodynamics really keeps organisms striving for more energy, okay? And that is that entropy will increase over time. And what entropy is disorder. It's things will fall apart over time. So second law of thermodynamics is really just entropy increases, okay? Well, that's true unless energy is supplied, okay? So if energy is supplied to the system, then the order can be maintained, okay? So we often think of entropy as this increase in destruction or increase in disorder, okay? But entropy only happens when no new energy can be entered into the system, okay? And that's why organisms strive to gain energy, because if you don't gain energy, you can't maintain what you have. So your cells will start breaking down, okay? Your tissues will start breaking down. If it's a plant, you know, the production of flowers won't happen, these kind of things. So disorder increases without a supply of energy. Okay? And we'll come back to this when we start talking about levels of feeding pyramids or food webs and things like that, because second law of thermodynamics plays an important role in that. Okay, so for the purpose of kind of this course, and really the purpose of most courses, energy, when we think about it, we can think about it as photons or sun energy, okay? We can think about it the energy that's coming from the sun is the energy that drives majority of processes on the planet, okay? It keeps organisms alive, it drives, you know, reproduction, drives almost everything that you can think about is really based on the energy that's coming from the sun. Now there are other types of energy that we can utilize, okay? As organisms or life energy, you can do chemosynthesis. So there's organisms that live near heat vents in the ocean that never get photons from the sun, but still have the ability to convert chemicals into energy. For the most part, we're not going to talk about them. They're interesting, they're really nice. If you take a marine science class, we'll talk a lot about it, but we're talking the majority of energy is coming from photons from the sun. And so I just kind of explained kind of the arche system of using chemicals to devise energy, okay? And so from these thermal vents and these hot springs, and even some hot springs in Wyoming. There are, you know, multiple hot springs, and there's some organisms in some of these hot springs that can do chemosynthesis, and they don't have to have photons in order to utilize energy to drive the production of carbohydrates. Okay, and that's called chemosynthesis, when you're using something other than photons and it's in a chemical form. Okay, and so we're not really going to talk too much about them because it's not a huge player in the system. Although, you know, probably 1/3 of all the biomass is represented by these organisms, or at least these organisms kind of touch on. Okay, so, and that's really has to come from, you know, the oceans are full of biomass, okay, and account for a ton of biomass, and a lot of the energy in the oceans are coming from chemosynthesis. The other thing that we'll probably talk about a little bit is the gases that are coming from these thermal vents under the ocean. Okay, there has been hypotheses, and there has been kind of entrepreneurs that might be going that route to capture some of the methane gases that are coming off and things like that, and use it as a resource for us terrestrial organisms to drive work. Okay, we'll probably approach this again when we talk about renewable resources and we talk about other possible sources of energy. But the one that we really want to talk about right now is energy from the sun, because that's driving most terrestrial systems. That's where people live, and that's the energy we know the most about. Okay, and that's the energy that we utilize most often. Okay, so solar energy, okay, is really important. Okay, and I already kind of hit on this. One, it plays a warmth factor. Okay, and this really just has to do with most organisms have a very narrow range at which they can exist on this planet. Okay? And they live in that narrow range. We call that their ecological niche, okay? Or ecological range. Okay? And outside of those temperatures, okay, the organism won't persist. The organism will die. And so because the energy from the sun is stable, okay, and constant, okay, organisms can live in bands on the planet, okay, certain regions on the planet, forever. Okay, per se forever. I mean, until the sun you know, burns out, which, you know, most estimates suggest about 3 billion years or so, and the sun will burn out, but then everything's gone. So in that aspect though, these organisms can live in this narrow range, okay, and they can occupy that space, that niche, and the sun is, you know, providing them warmth and that temperature range that they need to survive. But the most important piece that I want to talk about, and we'll talk about a lot more as we progress, okay, is photosynthesis. Okay, photosynthesis in plants is really the ability for an organism to capture photons and convert those photons into carbohydrates. We'll go into much more detail about how this occurs. Okay? We'll talk about it and we'll compare it to exactly what we're doing when we're using solar energy. And what are the comparable comparisons, and then where could solar be better? Okay? Or are there avenues from photosynthesis that we might utilize to drive a different process, not solar energy, but maybe hydro energy? Okay? And we'll come back and talk about these things. But photosynthesis is really just taking photons, converting them into carbohydrates or chemical bond energy. Okay. Now, a couple things about energy from the sun. Okay, so energy from the sun is not just light energy that we can see. Okay? A lot of the energy from the sun that's coming to the surface, okay, comes in different ways. waveforms. So like, 45% is going to be infrared waveforms, about 10% is ultraviolet, and then 45% or so is what we can see. So the interesting piece about that is often when we are looking at things and looking at energy, we only think about that 45% range, the 45% visible range. But there is a lot of energy outside of that range that possibly could be utilized. Okay? We know that most of the energy is absorbed by the land or the water or reflected back into space, but very little, okay, about 2%, is used by photosynthesis. So to think about that, you're talking about 98% of all the energy that comes to the planet, okay, is either absorbed by land or water or reflected back. Okay? So by designing capturing mechanisms, ways to capture solar radiation, okay, whatever that is, whether it's ultraviolet, visible, infrared, ways to devise and capture that is not really going to have an effect at all on photosynthetic plants, unless we decide to cover the landscape and replace all the plants with man-made mechanisms to capture this. But as long as that's not the case, you're not going to affect how much sunlight is available or how many photons is available for plant life to live. And that's a really integral part of us moving into a solar or potentially moving into a solar capturing mechanism for the majority of the energy on the planet to drive our work. Okay? It's important to know that, hey, there's a lot of energy out there that could be captured, okay, could be maintained, could be stored, okay, without affecting the energy that's needed for another organism. Okay? So here you can see what we're talking about when I talk about visible light. So visible light is from about 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers, somewhere in that range. Okay, and these are the colors of the rainbow. Okay, violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. Okay, and the reason why we see those different colors is because that's the wavelength that is reflected back, and that's the wavelength that our eyes pick up. And we'll talk about this more if you don't know how vision really works. Okay, we can talk about it more when we talk about different wave patterns. But that visible light spectrum, okay, is a fairly narrow band. Okay? There's a lot of other wavelengths, okay? Gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet, infrared, microwaves, radio waves, that are out here that we can detect. Okay? And we can detect with different sampling sources or sampling equipment. Okay? Now some of them have a huge potential, or potentially a huge potential, for capturing energy or for utilizing it as energy. Okay? It's things like ultraviolet and maybe infrared. Okay? And we'll come back and look at these later. So what is photosynthesis? Okay? Just in a nutshell, photosynthesis are plants inside their leaves. Not all of them, okay? But in a majority of plant leaves, you have organelles called chloroplasts. Okay? Inside that chloroplast, you have a substance called chlorophyll. There's a variety of chlorophylls, A, B. Okay? You also have these other substances called accessory pigments. You can have xenophils and carotenoids and some other things. Okay? And these pigments, okay, whether it's chlorophyll or carotenoids or whatever, have the ability to capture photons and utilize the energy from a photon, from light. They can utilize that energy to drive work. Okay? And so we get a simple equation like this. If a plant can take in water and carbon dioxide, and then photons or solar energy, it can convert that water and carbon dioxide and energy into chemical energy or bond energy in the form, in this case, of glucose, C6H12O6. At the same time, there's a waste product which is very beneficial to us being humans, called oxygen. Okay? So plants' purpose on the planet is really not to create oxygen, and actually if a plant holds oxygen in its body or in its tissue, it will die. Okay? So oxygen is actually toxic to plants. So it's their waste product, much like carbon dioxide is our waste product. If we hold carbon dioxide in our body, we will die. Okay? If they hold oxygen in their body or tissue, they will die. So the purpose of photosynthesis, really for a plant's perspective, is to create this stored energy, this chemical energy in the form of glucose or fructose and some other simple sugars. Okay? To hold it up and then store it. Okay? And a waste product of that is oxygen. Okay? And so really simple is that you take this water and this carbon dioxide and photons, okay, and through some processes that we can talk about later, okay, you form glucose and oxygen. Okay? Now the glucose that's formed can be stored as much more structured molecules. Okay? You can link them together. You can produce sucrose, you can produce starches, you can produce cellulose, you can produce glycogen, all these other molecules that can come from this basic carbohydrate of glucose. That is the primary fuel that really drives all metabolic processes. Metabolic processes we see in the plant itself, metabolic processes that we see in the organism that ate the plant, and on and on and on. So here's just a general diagram of photosynthesis. Okay, photons come in from the sun, or photons come in from a different light source. Like we can do this. You can grow plants in a greenhouse or in a closed box with just a light bulb. There's still photons, there's still energy coming from that. That's captured by chlorophyll. Okay, that chlorophyll is utilized to combine water and carbon dioxide. Okay, oxygen is a waste product, and carbohydrates are produced. Okay, so here's some carbohydrates here. Okay, we'll go through this whole process at a later date. Okay, and we'll look at both the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction of photosynthesis. Okay, but just an overview. Okay. Cellular respiration is basically the opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis captures energy, cellular respiration releases energy. Okay? And so cellular respiration is really taking those glucose molecules or taking carbon-based molecules and cleaving off hydrogens and carbons and oxygens, okay, to utilize the energy from breaking those bonds. Okay? As a result of that, often water is formed, which we call metabolic water, which means that you broke down sugars and created water. And then another product, okay, another waste product, which we call carbon dioxide. Okay? And so it's really just the exact opposite of photosynthesis. If you take that glucose molecule in, add some oxygen, okay, so this is a reverse of photosynthesis, okay, you can get water, carbon dioxide, and energy. So the two kind of equations work beautiful together. Photosynthesis makes chemical energy, cellular respiration breaks down chemical energy, and the waste products of each are utilized in the system that that you're interested in. Plants utilize water and carbon dioxide. Animals utilize oxygen and carbohydrates. Okay. So then, if we want to track this energy, we need to talk about what does it mean, to look at organisms kind of in a big picture. Okay? So we've talked about this a little bit before. Ecology is really just the study of organisms and their environment. Okay? Now we can look at species. Species is everything that, at least the biological species concept, is everything that can breed and occurs in the same area, same region, but can breed and produce viable, fertile offspring. Okay? That's what we call the biological species concept. Okay? We can talk about other species concepts that have been changed a little bit since modern technology with genetics and things like that. But a species is every organism that can produce viable offspring when mated. A population is all the species in a given area, okay, at the same time. Okay, same species. Has to be same species. And often when we talk about populations, we also normally talk about, well, they also have to be reproducing in that given area. Okay? That's often a caveat to a population. Okay? A biological community is all populations of all the different species, okay, interacting in a particular area. Okay? And then the ecosystem is taking all the living things plus the non-living things. So an ecosystem, we often talk about it, it's abiotic, which means non-living, and biotic. Okay, so abiotic plus biotic given area. That's your ecosystem. Okay. So now that brings us kind of to a food chain, food web analysis, and we'll go through these fairly quick, and then we'll analyze them, and I'll have you guys make some and things like that so you understand the energy flow and what's going on. A food chain is really simple. Food chain is really just linked feeding series. So primary producers ate by primary consumers, blah, blah, blah. So it's just a simple, simplistic kind of chain. A food web looks at a given area, typically, like an ecosystem, and it looks at all the organisms that can produce, all the organisms that can consume, and then the organisms that can consume them, and it links them. Because remember, sometimes organisms can feed at multiple levels, like humans. Okay? We can feed on, primary consumers, like we can eat a cow, but we could also eat the plant that the cow eats. Okay? So we can eat the primary producer. Okay? Some organisms don't have those capabilities, and we'll look at those feeding sources of those food webs. Okay? And it really will bring us to talking about trophic levels, okay? Or what is a producer? Right? This is an organism that we often call an autotroph, meaning that they can produce their own energy. Okay? Photosynthetically, chemosynthetically, something along those lines. Autotrophs. After that, we can talk about primary consumers, scavengers, detritivores, decomposers. Okay, we can talk about predators. These are all what we call heterotrophs. They consume energy that they didn't directly create, okay? And create in loose terms. Now, again, plants are not creating energy. Plants are just combining things. They're making larger molecules. They're capturing energy from the sun, okay? And they're creating larger molecules as stored energy. Okay, so I just want to make sure that you understand. Plants don't actually create energy. Nothing creates energy. Energy is not created nor destroyed. It's just changing shape, changing form. The energy is coming from the sun, okay, and it's changing from photon energy into bond energy, chemical energy. Okay? So we can look at something really simple as this food web. Okay? Man's at the top here. Okay? Man can consume plants. It could consume a wolf, even though there's no line here. It can consume a beaver. Okay? It can consume caribou. Okay? It can consume the rabbit. Okay? But in this process, it's just showing you what is typically consumed. Okay? And this is kind of the food web. So the man consumes caribou more often, also consumes plants. Okay, but if the man dies, the plants could consume it. The diatoms, fungus, these guys could consume it. This is just a typical food web. Okay? Now, it's very, very simplistic. Okay? A lot of organisms are not included in this web. Okay? From those webs, we can start making trophic levels, information about what feeds on what, and start labeling them. Okay? So like herbivores, or organisms that eat plants. Okay? So an example would be a deer. Okay? Carnivore, organisms that eat meat. Example, wolves. Omnivores, organisms that eat plants and meat. Bears, humans, things like that. Scavengers, organisms that typically eat carcasses. Now, crows is an example, but crows can also feed on plants. They can also feed on meat. So it's not specific. The example doesn't mean that it's specifically a scavenger. Now, sometimes it is, but often these organisms can move around, and it just depends on maybe the time of day, the month, depends on what's missing from their diet. And a crow might go and eat plants if it's missing certain nutrients from its diet. Detritivores, debris, ants, but ants again, they can eat meat, they can be carnivores, they can eat plant material, same thing. And decomposers, they'll eat all levels, things like bacteria. All right, this is more of a food web though. This is a web that you might be looking at and saying, all right, well, what's consuming what, and where's the connections? And this is looking at a web and a trophic level. So your primary producers or your autotrophs, are your plants. Then you got herbivores or your primary consumers, grasshoppers, ants, some types of ungulates that are flown in here, all kinds of things. And then you can look at your next level, your carnivores, that can eat certain pieces, and you see all these connection lines. And the reason why food webs are really important is because what happens if we remove something from the web? This is what ecologists often do, and then they see, well, what's going to happen to it if we remove something from the lab. If we remove cheetah from the lab, what might we expect? We could expect maybe Thompson's gazelles populations might increase, or since lions feed on the gazelle, lion population might have to increase to keep the gazelle population decrease. But if the gazelle population increases, maybe some of these other organisms that are feeding on plants, same plants that the gazelle feeds on, maybe they start to decrease. And so by analyzing a food web, you can see the effects of removing one organism. How does it affect the entire population of all the other organisms or the ecosystem? Okay, so that really brings us to ecological pyramids, which are based on trophic levels or food chains. Okay, but they're a little bit more than that, because ecological pyramids will often combine that with the energy that's moving from one source to the next. Okay, and so like I said before, the second law of thermodynamics suggests that energy has to be supplied in order to just maintain order. Okay, well, that maintaining of order increases as you move through the pyramid, okay? Which means energy is lost. More energy has to be utilized to keep the second law of thermodynamics in check. So that energy can be lost in many different forms. Metabolic processes, okay, are one of the main ways, but it can be lost as waste. So improper digestion or not being able to digest it. It could be lost as, in reproduction. It can be lost in lots of different ways. And this is called the 10% rule. Okay, so if you look at the 10% rule, if we had 100 kilograms of clover, okay, that will make about 10 grams of rabbit, okay, which would make about 1 gram of fox. Okay. Each level that you move through the pyramid, you're losing or you're maintaining 10%, or you're losing 90% of the energy. So here you can see what happens. Primary producers, whole bunch of photosynthetic plants. They're consumed by herbivores. Okay? So that means that you're already lost 90% of the energy, okay, to get to here. They lose it in body growth, they lose it in digestion, undigested food, they lose it as heat to the environment, okay? They lose it, in lots of different ways, okay? Reproduction, all kinds of things. Okay? Then you take that energy and you convert it again. Carnivores consume it. You lost again 90% of this energy. Okay? So now you have lost in the same thing. Heat, digestion, body growth, all these kind of things. Okay? And so this is why a lot of information has been written about, well, what trophic level should we be feeding at? Okay? To utilize the energies that we have on the planet in the best form, what portion of our diet should be carnivores, so us eating other carnivores, what portion should be herbivores, what portion should be primary producers. Okay? So here you can see just another example of that. Grassland, so let's say there's 1.5 million producers, okay? And then you get these, herbivores that are consuming those producers. You might have 200,000 of them. You get these primary carnivores that are eating these herbivores, about 90,000, and then you get one top carnivore that are eating these 90,000 primary carnivores. Okay, and so this shouldn't be a surprise to most people when you go out and you're like, hey, I really want to see a wolf. Well, there's only 200 wolves in the state of Wyoming, and there's 150,000 elk. And if you want to see how many grassland species there are, or how many grassland organisms there are in a given region, okay, you might be talking that million, maybe even more than that, okay, that the elk could feed on. And as you move up, okay, there's less and less energy to be divvied out. Okay? If you're interested in kind of looking at our role, okay, when it comes to feeding in the environment, okay, I suggest Michael Pollan's book. He's an excellent writer when it comes to food. He's also an excellent writer when it comes to kind of ecology and what it means to feed at different trophic levels. Okay, Omnivore's Dilemma is my favorite book from Pollan, but I also like Food Rules, where he talks about, how should we be eating in an environment. Yes, we're omnivores, okay, but what portion of our diet should be meat and what portion should be plants, based on an energetic perspective, not based on a flavor. And he's not trying to get people to be vegetarians, because we are omnivores. Okay? Not that there's anything wrong with being a vegetarian, but this is about, from an ecological, energetic point of view, what portion should be plant, what portion should be animal. Excellent reads. I highly suggest them. And I will talk to you guys more about energy, ecology next time.